The Smiths are one of those bands that feel almost impossible to talk about without slipping into some kind of personal reflection. Whether you've discovered them through a friend, a movie soundtrack, or just stumbled on that jangly guitar tone one day and felt something shift in you, there's something undeniably magnetic about them. They weren't the biggest band in the 80s in terms of chart dominance and mainstream fame, but their influence runs deeper than most groups who were topping the charts at the time. It's like every lonely kid in their bedroom and every outsider trying to figure themselves out somehow found a piece of themselves in the Smiths' music. Formed in Manchester in the 1980s, the Smiths only existed for a brief moment, just a few years really, but they burned with this intensity that bands twice their lifespan never reach. Morrissey's lyrics tapped into a strange blend of vulnerability and wit, while Johnny Marr's guitar work brought a kind of brightness and intricacy that no one else was making at the time. Together, they built a sound that was both sad and uplifting, dramatic yet strangely comforting. And even though the band's story is short, it's packed with enough tension, brilliance, and emotional weight to still spark conversations decades later. What makes the Smiths so fascinating isn't just the music, though the music alone would be enough to cement their legacy. It's the way their songs captured the awkwardness, hope, and heartbreak of being young. They weren't trying to be cool, they were just trying to be honest, and somehow that honesty became their greatest influence in their music. Their rise, their peak, and their unraveling, and it all happened so fast, almost too fast. But that's what gives their story that sense of mythology. They appeared suddenly, changed the landscape of British music, and disappeared just as quickly. And the strange thing is, maybe that's why they still feel so untouched. Frozen in their prime, untainted by reunions or nostalgia tours. They're just four people who came together at the exact right moment and fell apart just as quickly. In this video, I'm going to break down the journey of the Smiths from beginning to end. How they formed, how they skyrocketed, why everything fell apart, and why their influence still refuses to fade. So, as always, I'm Tristan, and this is the history of the Smiths. The rise of the Smiths almost feels like something that wasn't supposed to happen. Like this strange collision of personalities and timings that the universe accidentally got right. When Johnny Marr knocked on Morrissey's door in 1982, the two of them barely knew each other. But Marr had a gut feeling. He always described it like he knew instinctively that Morrissey was the missing piece to the band he'd been imagining in his head for years. And Morrissey, who'd spent most of his early life writing in isolation, suddenly had somebody who could translate that inner world into sound. There's a kind of magic in that pairing. Morrissey brought the words, they were dramatic and painfully self-aware, and Marr brought the music, with shimmering guitar lines, bright chords, and this natural sense of melody that felt effortless. So effortless in fact that their very first writing session produced Suffer Little Children, a song so bold and dark that it proved immediately that this band was not going to play it safe. When Andy Rourke and Mike Joyce joined shortly after, the lineup clicked into place. Rourke's bass lines were melodic and emotional, while Joyce's drumming grounded everything with this clean, steady pulse. Together, the four of them built a sound that didn't quite fit into anything else happening in the early 80s. While the UK was dominated by synth pop and flashy production, the Smiths arrived with jangly guitars, raw vocals, and lyrics that were almost uncomfortably honest. Their first shows were small, surrounded by sweaty backrooms, cheap stages, and barely working microphones, but the connection was immediate. Fans weren't just watching a band, they were watching something genuinely different. Morrissey's presence was awkward and magnetic at the same time. He didn't move like a typical frontman, but he didn't need to. He leaned into his own strangeness, waving flowers around, wearing oversized blouses, singing about alienation and desire in a way that felt new. And Marr, who was usually the quiet one, stood beside him playing guitar parts that sounded like they were pulled straight out of some magic alternative version of pop music. Things started moving very quickly. John Peel, who was one of the most influential radio voices in the UK at the time, heard their early demos and immediately invited them in for one of his Peel sessions. That moment was huge. It introduced the Smiths to an audience that didn't even know they were looking for them. Suddenly, they weren't just another Manchester band. They were a band people were paying attention to. Their debut single, Hand in Glove, didn't explode on the charts, but it sparked something far more important, a cult following. People didn't just like the song, they felt connected to it. It had that rare combination of hope and melancholy that would come to define their sound. And even though it wasn't a mainstream hit, it opened the door to opportunities the band had only dreamed of months earlier. Within a year, the Smiths had a record deal, growing press attention, and a fanbase that felt fiercely loyal. Every time Morrissey wrote something personal, the fans treated it like a diary entry. And every time Marr came up with a new riff, it felt like the band was pushing against the edges of what guitar-driven music could sound like. And what really made their rise so memorable was how unlikely it was. They didn't look like pop stars, they didn't sound like what was popular, they weren't polished or calculated, they were four young men figuring themselves out in real time, and that rawness was exactly what the era needed. By 1983, the Smiths weren't just rising up the charts, they were becoming one of the most important new bands in Britain, and the pressure that came with that would push them into their defining era, one where their talents would peak, but so would the cracks forming quietly beneath the surface. The peak of the Smiths was sudden. It was intense and almost unreal. Between 1984 and 1986, they released the music that would define not just their career, but an entire generation of alternative and indie music. It's the period where everything finally lined up. Their songwriting, their chemistry, their public image, and their impact. But just beneath all of the brilliance, tension was already quietly settling in. Their self-titled debut album, The Smiths, arrived in early 1984 and immediately sounded like nothing else. Morrissey's lyrics were personal to the point of discomfort, yet still poetic and strangely humorous. Songs like Reel Around the Fountain and This Charming Man didn't just feel like songs, they felt like secrets being whispered through speakers. And Johnny Marr's guitar didn't follow traditional leads or rhythmic rolls. Instead, it danced through the tracks, layering brightness over Morrissey's melancholy, creating this bittersweet sound that no one else could replicate at the time. But it was their second album, Meat is Murder, that pushed them into another space entirely. It was darker, more political, and more confident. They weren't just singing about loneliness anymore. They were calling out society, they were calling out the government, the school system, and the treatment of animals, just about anything they could get their hands on. The title track sparked controversy. The headmaster ritual attacked authority, and That Joke Isn't Funny Anymore revealed a depth of emotional complexity that most bands wouldn't even attempt. The band went to number 1 in the UK, proving that messages this heavy and this uncomfortable could still resonate with the mainstream audience. During this time, the Smiths weren't just a band, they were more of a movement. Fans dressed like Morrissey. They carried flowers to shows, they took his words to gospel, they saw themselves in his vulnerability and sarcasm. He wasn't a traditional rock star. He was awkward, dramatic, poetic, and painfully honest. And in a world that often values confidence over sincerity, that honesty hit like a lightning strike. And then, in 1986 came The Queen is Dead, widely considered their masterpiece. This album is the moment where every element of the Smiths landed perfectly. Johnny Marr's guitar work was at its absolute peak, building walls and waves of sound that somehow always felt so precise and emotional. Rourke's bass lines were melodic and alive, Joyce's drumming was minimal but powerful, and Morrissey was sharper than ever, delivering lines that were funny, cutting, romantic, and devastating, all at once. There Is a Light That Never Goes Out became more than just a song. It became an anthem for anyone who had felt invisible, misunderstood, or desperate for a genuine human connection. People didn't just listen to it, they clung to it. Big Mouth Strikes Again was defiant and sarcastic. I Know It's Over was crushing and exposed. The entire album felt like a diary made for the public, and somehow the world thanked them for it. At this point, the Smiths were becoming one of the most important bands in the world, but success wasn't making them closer, it was slowly pulling them apart. Behind the scenes, tensions were rising. Morrissey and Marr, who once were creatively inseparable, started drifting in different directions. Marr was becoming increasingly influenced by electronic music and more polished production, whilst Morrissey wanted to stay rooted in traditional, emotionally driven songwriting. Rourke and Joyce also began to feel underappreciated. Management decisions, legal issues, and exhaustion from touring only added to the strain on the band. However, there was another weight hanging over everything, and that was Morrissey's personality. Whilst his openness and intensity made the music powerful, it also made relationships difficult. He was sensitive and stubborn, and often impossible to compromise with. Marr, on the other hand, was growing restless. He wanted more freedom, more room for evolution. The band that had once felt like a perfect creative collision was now starting to feel like a creative cage. The strangest part of all of this is that none of it showed in the music. If anything, their best work came as everything behind the scenes was breaking. That's what makes their peak so haunting. They weren't riding a wave of happiness, they were creating masterpieces in the middle of tension, confusion, and emotional distress. By late 1986, the Smiths had reached the highest point they would ever reach, but they were already beginning to fall. And in true Smiths fashion, the downfall wouldn't be loud or explosive. It'd be slow, tense, painful, and ultimately unavoidable. For a band that had created such a powerful sense of connection, the Smiths began to feel more and more disconnected from inside themselves. While the world continued to celebrate them, something behind the scenes was quietly dissolving. It wasn't one big explosive argument or a dramatic break, it was a slow emotional erosion, filled with unspoken resentment, frustration, and exhaustion. At the center of the fracture was the relationship between Morrissey and Marr. What had once been a perfectly balanced creative partnership was now beginning to feel like a tug of war. Morrissey was becoming more fixated on control and routine. He wanted the band to stay in an emotional, poetic bubble they had built. Johnny Marr, on the other hand, didn't want to stay still. He was growing faster than the band could keep up with. Him experimenting, collaborating with other artists, and imagining futures for the music that didn't line up with Morrissey's vision. Although they weren't fighting because they hated each other, they were drifting because they had grown into completely different people. Add in the exhaustion of constant touring, the pressures of expectation, and the lack of real communication, the magic that had once felt effortless just started to feel heavy. The music still worked, sometimes even more beautifully than before, but the people making it were quietly falling apart. Then, without a big announcement, without anything, Johnny Marr left. There was no headline show, no grand goodbye. He simply stepped away, and in doing so took a huge piece of the Smiths' heart with him. And even though the band technically tried to continue, everyone involved knew the truth. Without Marr and Morrissey together, it wasn't really the Smiths anymore. It was just a shadow of something that had already ended. Their final album, Strange Ways Here We Come, was finished in this strange emotional limbo, and when you listen to it now, it almost feels haunting. Not because the music is bad, it actually isn't, it's quite incredible, but because it sounds like the echo of a band that already knew was over. Some tracks felt brighter and more experimental, almost as if Marr was already mentally stepping into his future. Others sound reflective, detached, like Morrissey had already begun looking inwards. Shortly after the album's completion, the announcement finally came. The Smiths had broken up. No reunion plans, no farewell tour, just silence. The remaining members of the band all went their separate ways. Morrissey went into a long, complicated solo career. Marr went into years of collaboration, respected musicianship. Rourke and Joyce into legal battles and personal struggles. But the strangest part of all wasn't what happened to them afterwards. It was what happened to the fans. Because instead of fading away, the Smiths became even bigger. Their songs kept finding new listeners. Teenagers who weren't even born when the band existed, somehow feeling exactly what Morrissey had sung decades later. The heartbreak, the humour, the loneliness, the longing. It survived time, trends, and entire generations. And I suppose that's what makes their decline so haunting. It wasn't a fall from grace, it was just a band that burned so brightly too quickly that there was no way that it could keep going without destroying itself. So instead, it ended, frozen at its peak, preserved in perfection, made immortal by its own ending. The story of the Smiths is strange, beautiful, and a little tragic, but that's exactly why it never faded. They weren't built for longevity, they weren't a band that could exist comfortably for decades, drifting through different eras and different sounds. They were a moment in time, a very specific collision of time, place, personality, and emotion. And moments like that don't last forever, they're just not meant to. What makes the Smiths so powerful isn't just their music or even their influence, it's the feeling they captured, that feeling of being so out of place, or being too sensitive, or too awkward, or too honest for the world around you. Morrissey gave people a voice for their loneliness, and Johnny Marr built a sound that made loneliness feel strangely beautiful. And together, for a brief few years, they made people feel less alone in themselves. Their short lifespan almost feels intentional now. There was no grand comeback, no reunion tours, and no chance for the magic to dilute. Instead, they remain frozen in the exact version of themselves that changed everything. They're pure, untouched, and preserved. And maybe that's the most perfect ending they could have ever asked for. Because the Smiths didn't just create music, they created a world. And even though they left it, people are still finding their way to it every single day. Through headphones, through bedrooms, through car windows on rainy nights, their songs still sit behind people during heartbreak, during their self-discovery, and during moments where the world feels impossible. 5 years, 4 albums, and no reunions, and yet an endless legacy.